My name's Brandon Keim. I'm a freelance journalist, and we are here to debate the future of conservation. And I would like to set the stage by referencing a paper that was published earlier this year in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it was entitled the Biomass Distribution on Earth. And the authors were trying to figure out how much lives here now and how much does it compare to the life that existed on Earth before humans became real big. And they estimated that since the beginning of human civilization, the biomass of all plants on Earth has decreased by about half. If you look at mammals, there's now the total biomass of all mammals has decreased by something like a factor of 7. If you add up the weight of humans and all of our livestock, it outweighs the rest of vertebrate life, excepting fish, by something like a factor of 15. It's huge. And so I bring that up, not to make us feel bad, because the biosphere circa 2018 is still a marvelous place. But just to convey the scale at which humanity operates, and really, the fate of life on Earth is intertwined with the actions we take and the values that we share. And from a whole Earth perspective, I really think that the most important question in the world is, how do we make conservation work? How do we protect the biodiversity on this Earth? And one answer to that question is the resolution that we'll be debating here today. And that is that the most viable path to conserving global biodiversity is through urbanization, economic growth, and agricultural intensification. Arguing for the resolution, we have here Eric Sanderson. He's a senior conservation ecologist at the Wildlife Society. His most Wildlife Conservation Society. And his most recent book is Terra Nova, The New World After Oil, Cars, and Suburbs. Arguing against the resolution is Helen Kopnina. She coordinates the Sustainable Business Program at the Hague University of Applied Science in the Netherlands. She is the co-author or co-editor of 13 books, including Culture and Conservation Beyond Anthropocentrism. So thank you two very much. And Eric, the next 4 minutes are yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Helen and I have a few slides to show. So can we have the first slide, please? Thank you. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Eric Sanderson from the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York. And early on in my career in conservation, I helped lead a team that created this map of human influence on Earth. We call it the human footprint. We added together data on human population density, land use, transportation infrastructure, and the lights the satellite can see at night. And if you add all these together, you get this map that shows the gradient of human influence from the darkest colors indicating the cities, through the sort of orange and red colors, which are suburban areas and rural farming areas, into the greener areas, which are the wild places. And if you add up all the areas that aren't dark green on this map, it's 83% of the land surface, or 98% of the places where you can grow rice, wheat, or corn, the 3 major crops consumed by humanity. So, I would argue that there's really two responses to this map. They're not mutually exclusive at all. One is to save the green bits, to save the last of the wild, and this is the standard conservation answer. And it's the answer that most of my colleagues take, that that's what we're actually committed to doing, is saving wildlife and saving the wild places in the world, the last of the wild. But another response is to transform the human footprint, to work in the orange and red and black bits. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about. What creates the human footprint? Well, this is an early idea in conservation. It's the IPAT relationship that says that environmental impact is the product of population, affluence, which we can kind of think of as per capita consumption, and technology. And if any one of these factors goes up, according to the Eldrick and Holdren way of thinking about the world, then impact on the environment will also go up. So let's actually look at some data about these factors. So this is a graph from a paper that I published in the spring with 2 colleagues. The first graph is showing population trajectory between 1800 and 2200. Of course, we're not to 2200, so you can see the dotted lines on these, all three of these figures are either cobbled together from survey data or the projections into the future. And of course, we live in a world that has seen the population grow tremendously over the last 200 years. And you can see that there, that we're at 7.4 billion, going up to some future. And those three lines you see there are the high, medium, and low variants from the UN population. That medium variant assumes that the whole world gets to stable population, stable fertility for women around 2100, and then it stays there. The bottom line, the low variant, is actually if the whole world adopted the fertility and mortality patterns of the developed world, and in that scenario, a world by 2200 would have something like 2.5 billion people, not 10 billion people in it. The second one I want to show you is the graph of extreme poverty. We talk a lot about how income hasn't been equally distributed in the world. And in fact, the lower end of the income spectrum has been gaining tremendously over the last 200 years. And you can see that 100 years ago, 80% of people were extremely poor, making less than $2 a day. But it's possible by 2030 that that'll be less than 500 million people globally. And what's driving both of those is the idea of urbanization, which you see on the third graph, that by the end of the century, 80% of the world's population could live in towns and cities. This is some more population trajectories, which is just to say that demographics isn't an inevitability. Actually, there are many different possible trajectories. Some are more optimistic or some are less optimistic in terms of conservation. But what I really want to say is that urbanization is the factor that drives these more than others. If you look at these three graphs, they show how the crude death rate, the crude birth rate, and the population growth rate change with urbanization. And you'll note that the death rate drops first, and then the birth rate, and that drives drops in the population growth rate. At the same time that urbanization is associated with increases in per capita income, decreases in poverty, and increases of education. So our argument is that if we're going to see a better world for conservation, we need to go through this bottleneck period that we're experiencing now, but that could lead to a tremendous breakthrough by the end of the century that could rewrite what conservation means for the future. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, so just skip those, sorry.
That's yours.
Yeah, those are the appendix. We'll come back to those. Yep.
Okay. Well, hello. Very pleased to be here, especially because I was very surprised to be invited since I was a critic of some things that happened at the Institute. Well, I'm one of the very few people who speaks with an accent here, so apologies if you don't understand me, but it also kind of sets the stage for my perception of things that might be slightly different than the majority perception, or I hope not too much. First of all, I want to define a couple of terms. I call myself an environmentalist, and that in itself is interesting because I think all of you guys here in the audience could be called environmentalists in one way or other. It depends on our definition of things. Rachel, I think, during her discussion about how to change the art of changing mind, was talking about environmentalists who make own yogurt and refuse vaccinations to their children. Well, I'm not sure about that, but anyway, by some definition, people who support nuclear energy, for example, they think of cleaner energy. We all have different opinions about that, and my own environmentalism, being an anthropologist, teaching at the business school as I do, stems from one thing, and that is how I value biodiversity. And how I value biodiversity has to do with ecocentrism, which refers to something that values intrinsic value of what we call environment. So another definition would be modernity, and I don't exactly know how to define it. This is the subject of our debate, of course, but you can give any kind of feeling to that. You can see it as business as usual when things that are already happening now, all kind of complex factors, are happening even quicker. So, some effects of modernity can be good, some can be bad. Any idea like what these areas have in common? It's a hypothetical question, you'd never guess. The left one is Chernobyl, and the right one is Fukushima. You know, nuclear energy can be good for environment. All kinds of things in the cities can be good for environment. If you have intensive agriculture, you also have cheap food. You have obesity. You also have transport. So obesity can kill you. Pollution of cars can kill you. Car accidents can kill you. Can be good for the environment, smaller population. I don't think this is the stuff we actually want, necessarily. So in terms of urbanization, I would say maybe it's good for environment. It depends. Again, it very much depends on what we do with this urbanization. It could be compact, so you put people into a small territory in cities. They occupy less space. It can be also bad in some ways, so I say a maybe to this. The same for intensive agriculture. We've discussed it yesterday. There was a great debate about it, so I don't think I need to go into tillage versus organic versus whatever. Can be good, can be bad, can be used on a small scale, large scale, occupy more territory. What I'm really against is the idea of economic growth. And in this way, I'm together with Daniel O'Neill, who talks about degrowth. GDP in itself is not good, is not bad. We can have economic growth with good things like services or your grandma selling socks, you know, whatever. But it could be also bad things. And the effects on biodiversity of economic growth are not at all that obvious. And the problem with it, too, is that I feel that decoupling of economic growth from resource consumption, the absolute decoupling is impossible because we are pretty large animals. We eat, we drink, we need clothes. You know, you can have some decoupling with circular economy and such, but you cannot have a complete one. So my questions are ethical in regard to feeding the world, et cetera. Why are we feeding just one species? Why are we not talking about territory and food for all different species as well? And yeah, I want to not agree to disagree just, but I also want to have some kind of discussion with my opponent that we share a lot of ideas with, as a matter of fact, in terms of future solutions. That's it.
Okay.
And so the tension, as I see it here, is really, Eric, you have a good deal of confidence in the systems and patterns that we've seen exhibited in the prosperous world. And Helen, you are really saying, I don't have that degree of confidence, and values are crucial to it. Is that?
Well, I mean, I would say values are really important, right? I mean, what is the point of being a human being on Earth? Someone said the other day that maybe the ultimate goal of human life is to fulfill our human potential. And I would say that that's an important goal, but that's not the end goal for me. The end goal is to fulfill our human potential so that we can take care of the world, so we can take care of our families and our friends, and for nature, for the community of nature. So I think that's a place that Helen and I would agree. I think what I want to sort of contribute to this conversation is that many of the arguments I've heard made here at the breakthrough dialogues sort of make these assumptions about what the future of population will be, what the future of development patterns will be, and therefore we have to do this, we have to do that, and most of the solutions are technological in nature. And I think what I'm trying to raise, both for the conservation community and for this community, is that there are large-scale factors in play around population stabilization, around the choices that people make about fertility, and where they choose to live. And that urbanization isn't only a matter of its land use effects, but also the behavioral effects. The choices people make and can make are facilitated to make when they move to towns and cities. So, you know, to respond a little more directly to what Helen was saying, you know, urbanity, I mean, urbanness is really important. And you can do it right and you can do it wrong. And there's many, many examples of how we do it wrong. So we really need to be thinking about how do we promote the policies that make it right, that make cities that work for people, all kinds of people, wherever they are on the economic scale, including the exposure of nature in cities. So that's a really important point. I also am a little bit I don't know, a little more skeptical about intensive agriculture per se. I think in some places that's the right way to go. Other places, I think more of a land sharing kind of approach makes more sense. But where I might disagree with Helen, if you let me, is that I think there is going to be more economic growth. I don't think economic growth is unalloyed bad or an unalloyed good. I actually think it's just a measure of the number of interactions there are in the economy, right? What do we measure when we measure GDP? We measure the number of interactions, the number of trades that are made, and the size of those trades. And the sum of that, the weighted sum, is GDP. And so economic growth is, the way you get it is having more interactions in the future or interactions of larger sizes, right? That's how you get economic growth. Where does that economic growth come from? Well, as Thomas Piketty pointed out in his book, one place it comes from is demographic growth, right? If you have more people interacting with each other, you have more interactions, therefore the GDP grows. And he thinks something like 50% of GDP growth simply comes from population growth. Where does the other 50% come from? Well, it comes from people getting access to capital and getting access to tools and getting access to opportunities to use their particular skills better, right? And where does that come from? And that mostly comes from cities and urbanization. So what I'm saying is that we've built an economic model that depends upon the assumption of population growth and the assumption that people will move from rural areas to towns and cities. I mean, where has the tremendous economic growth in China over the last 20 years come from? It's come from the fact that they allowed people to choose where they wanted to live, that they didn't require rural people to live in rural areas, but actually allowed them to move to cities. And so, that's the path we're on right now, but we can see an end to that. There only can be so much urbanization, 100% of people can't live in cities, probably 70 to 80% on a global scale. And when we get to that point, that is what's going to actually lead to a much lower level of economic growth. The Piketty, over the long term, estimates about 0.1% per year over the long term. So maybe we'll be able to do it at 1% or 2% through innovation in the future. There'll always be some small amount of economic growth, but the kinds of benefits that people are getting out of economic growth and the poor distribution, the unfair distribution of income that comes from that economic growth, those factors are going to change a lot in the future. And within our lifetimes, the lifetimes of our kids. So, thank you very much.
Well, that just shows that we agree, actually, because I also said that economic growth is not good and bad. It depends. But I want to return also to your question about values. And I think in sustainability in general, you have two things. One is the practical challenge, and another one is ethical challenge. When we talk about saving the world or feeding the people, oftentimes it's seen as a normative, moral thing to do. What I'm trying to bring into this discussion too is the question of how can we actually possibly think of this world and these kind of debates and discussions in terms of sharing space with non-humans, the ones that are left still. And not just the ones that we eat, experiment on, but, probably from the time that we started this talk, just about 10 minutes ago, how many chicken, cows have been slaughtered. And I was very pleased to hear about the Memphis meats this morning, because, indeed, this is one great technological solution, I think, practically speaking. Again, this is both about practicalities and about morals, where things nicely come together. And that is indeed something that perhaps, again, we don't disagree on, so that way it's kind of difficult to argue. I just tend to be a bit more pessimistic about things like demographic transition theory. The fact that, yes, we do see in Japan, for example, and in my own country, in Russia, you have negative population growth, in most countries in Northern Europe, etc. Population has gone down. If it wasn't for the flows of migrations, actually in the Netherlands, where I live, we would also have 1.6 children per woman. Fertility is low. But it's not the same everywhere. Sub-Saharan Africa, in one of Eric's articles, he calls it an exception that demonstrates the rule. Well, that's something that I don't necessarily agree with. And I don't believe that population growth can be solved by just a rising GDP, or putting people into cities, or having cheap agricultural produce. None of this. There are other factors that might play a role. Some of them we're not even going to discuss. It might be politically incorrect. Some of them have to do with cultural values, whatnot. And even, let's say if sub-Saharan Africa or countries like Nigeria or Niger Delta, where you have about 8.9 children per woman, according to a recent corrective report, because officially it was 7, but it turns out there are some children that are unregistered, and even by some estimates, 10 children per family. Let's say that you raise the economic living situation there to the level of the United States. To people like me, I have an American passport. It doesn't sound like it, but I do. I also have a Dutch passport. Look at me. I'm wearing leather shoes. I have 3 children. Only one of them is vegetarian. I fly around the world. I consume a lot. And I call myself environmentally conscious, actually, in some way. And if you have 7.5 billion of people like me with my teenage children who also fly around the world, et cetera, I don't see it as a good thing. So first you have to take away from people like me. I'm Russian, so maybe I'm thinking in terms of revolution, then redistribute it to, poor people. But you can't just increase the life standards everywhere without taking away from somewhere. Yesterday I was sitting at this little panel about energy and development. It was all about how to raise living standards in Africa. Yeah, well, that's indeed. How do we make 7.5 billion people the winners of this development without, pardon my French, fucking up the earth? That's the big question. Thank you.
And I don't want to forestall you from responding directly to that, but if I just could clarify the differences for myself, it would, be that, it feels like you have a great deal of confidence in urbanization and agricultural intensification and economic growth to lead to a smaller population, a smaller footprint for the people that we have, and also to encourage the right kind of values, which you agree with Helen are so important. Mm-hmm. Why, especially for the value side of that, why are those 3 things, why are those 3 processes so good for the right kind of values?
Right. So I'm not going to argue the intensive agricultural point with you, but it's true. If you do urbanization right, urbanization does 3 things for you. It helps you change behaviors. It helps you reduce poverty, to in fact eliminate poverty in some cases, extreme poverty. And the third thing is cities are crucibles of innovation. All great ideas actually have come from people working together in towns and cities. All terrible ideas also have come from people working together in towns and cities. Which I think one of the things I want to add into the dialogue here is that I know that there's a lot of excitement around various kinds of technological solutions, as in the IPAT relationship, right? What is that T going to be? And are there technological approaches to getting us out of the conundrums? And I actually don't think technological approaches on their own will work. It's only the circumstances we build around those technologies that can help us succeed, the economic and social technologies, if you like. So things like tax policy matter a lot to conservation. Things like, the regulatory policies matter a lot to conservation. One of the critiques of my approach is that it's inevitable. Like, these things are so large and they've been moving for so long that therefore they will inevitably happen. And I think that's completely wrong. You have to understand that there are different trajectories of the demographic transition, and policy has a lot to say which trajectory we're on. The most optimistic one, has the world's population topping out in 2065, 2070 at 9.5 billion people, and then actually falling through 2100. But the least one, which is sort of the one of resurgent nationalism and where the developed world sort of turns in on itself and abandons the rest of the world, is the world that has 12 billion people by the end of the century. That's a very large difference that we should be thinking about. And it's going to have huge implications for human society, not just for the natural world. So, I think these things are really important, and they're not inevitable, and they have a lot to do with the conditions around which we construct our society. No, my time is up, so give it over to you.
Is it possible to go back to the same slide that I was at? No, huh?
No, we can only go forward as eco-modernists.
I see, we can only go forward. All right. Well, again, you are.
Going backwards.
Next one, please.
Go.
Yeah, great. Actually, the other way around. Let's put it this way. I think I have to go in this way. Okay. Well, look, I mean, I actually did want to spend a bit of time talking about solutions and change of values. One of the change of values things I see as necessary is thinking about it in terms of, well, I'm an educator myself, so I teach at my business school, so I don't teach to the converted, which is a good thing. But yeah, one of the things I do teach is very much about recognizing the value of non-human and questioning certain normative moral assumptions that we have about what's good in the world. And I think, indeed, when we talk about demographic transition now, practically speaking, again, that's a very nice value which can coincide with social justice perspectives as well, because it's not just, for me, it's not about raising the GDP, it's about addressing things like women's rights, very much, because the same girls in Niger Delta, you know, I'm an anthropologist, I used to work with that. Some of them get pregnant at the age of 12. Some of them have 3 kids by the age they are my daughter's age, 18-year-old. And I don't think it's a matter of choice in that way. You know, it's very much a question of looking at reproductive rights, women's rights, etc. So it's a bit of a win-win situation there. The values that we already have, anthropocentric values, which are focused on social justice, great, goes hand in hand with what I'm proposing here. So you don't even have to change these values, but to add to them, one of the things is the value of growth. Because why should it be, why did we integrate it in our heads that progress and growth are related and it's the highest good that we can have? Societies in Africa as well used to be completely self-sufficient. You know, they used to grow their own food, whatever, before the age of colonialization, for example. And now everybody seems to have integrated our Western idea of growth. And, you know, you are underdeveloped or undeveloped if you're not following the path, which is a very stupid path, as far as I'm concerned, of our Western civilization. So that's one thing. And a few other things are more related to, let's say, pragmatic or practical ideas, how to do it, because I'm not a utopian thinker thinking, you know, we should all go back to the caves. And, you know, environmentalism is often associated with this kind of backward thinking. As you said, we should all go forward. I agree with that. Well, there are ideas about it. I've already mentioned Daniel O'Neill and degrowth strategies. There's the steady state economy. So Herman Daly wrote a lot about it. Very interesting. Don't want to go into details now, however. Circular economy. A lot of what goes for circular economy, unfortunately, is greenwashing, because circular economy attempts to decouple material consumption from economy. Sometimes it doesn't work, especially when we talk about food, for example, or again, clothes, material things. But attempts are there, and there are a lot of good case studies that I actually handle together with my students. We look at certain products, processes, etc., in which things work. Another pragmatic thing is just thinking about urbanization and cities, rewilding within the cities, starting from green roofs. That's the kind of development we have in the Netherlands now. I must say, the Netherlands, I've talked to quite a few of you in the past few days, and you all assume that the Netherlands is nice and green and everybody is biking around and there are windmills, you know. Well, yes, we have that. Everybody who rides a bike also has a car. Per capita consumption, and as far as recent numbers I've seen, is pretty much the same as the Americans. We use about 95% fossil fuels. While it's a rich country, you think, you know, ecological modernization, post-material values, you get rich, you start caring for environment, you start doing things for environment. No. The Netherlands is doing pretty badly also within the EU as far as being a leader in all kind of things, among other things, because we have a couple of companies that all of you know, such as Shell, Philips, Heineken, et cetera, most of their operations are abroad. So again, you know, in green roofs, in the Dutch houses, in Amsterdam where I live, that's all very nice, you know, but the large-scale greening hasn't happened yet, and that's, I think, the greatest opportunity that we have there. And one of them is small-scale rewilding. You know, urban parks now, they are full of fertilizers, and you know, they're constantly trimmed, etc. Well, let's allow flowers to grow and natural insect pollinators to come there, and birds, etc. There's a lot of room for growth and a lot of ideas from modernity, such as cultured meat, that could be used indeed to go forward.
Right. Well, adding some more ingredients to the mix is our first respondent, Reed Noss. And Reed is the president of the Florida Institute for Conservation Science.
Good morning, everyone. It's been a great couple days here. So if modernization inevitably includes urbanization, where does this lead us in terms of our relationship with nature? So Eric, I worry that by ignoring the consequences of the loss of experience of nature that usually accompanies urbanization, you paint too optimistic a picture of our possible breakthrough future. I grew up until third grade in a dense, lower middle class neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio. It was an old neighborhood, but there was still a bit of relatively wild, undeveloped land within a few blocks from my home, most of it within the floodplain of Wolf Creek. I presume that someone long ago saw a wolf along that creek. There was no family name of that type there. And I always found this exciting, but also tragic because the wolves were long gone. But of course, we kids could imagine those wolves. There, my friends and I along Wolf Creek would climb trees, catch frogs and snakes, seine for minnows with my mom's kitchen strainer, which she just loved, and experience a world that was beyond humans and technology. It was wonderful in the true sense of the term. I've gone back to that neighborhood. The wild, undeveloped land along Wolf Creek is gone. In its place are apartment complexes. Wolf Creek itself is mostly channelized in concrete. The frogs and snakes and minnows are gone. I've seen the same kind of thing happen in other cities I've known in the past and have revisited more recently. Yet, ironically, this urban infill process is seen by so-called smart growth advocates as a good thing. Increase urban density, thereby reduce urban sprawl and ex-urban development. But at what cost? And by the way, the sprawl continues. I don't think urban infill is good at all if urban people lose the opportunity to connect with nature. I doubt it is a spurious correlation that as a region urbanizes, the ecological literacy and natural history knowledge of the populace declines. Many studies have documented this trend, and I know it from personal experience. My original field was outdoor education. I've led many nature walks for urban kids as well as rural and outer suburb kids. And I can assure you, those urban kids, sadly, were much less attuned to nature. Meanwhile, recent research demonstrates that urban dwellers are generally less healthy physically, largely due to air pollution, as well as less healthy emotionally. Looking at it from the other side, where I think the evidence is stronger, actually, research shows the salubrious effects of regular exposure to natural areas. For example, forest bathing in the Japanese tradition. ADHD in children, anxiety and depression in adults, all decline with time spent in nature. Richard Louv and many others have documented this thoroughly. Eric, you write in your bioscience article that, quote, developing a broadly shared environmental consciousness about nature is predicated on an unimpoverished, largely urbanized world that shares the positive externalities of education, technology, and indeed nature conservation. I wish I could be so optimistic, but I just can't. People living in urban areas who want or need to experience wild nature these days must drive increasingly long distances to find it, thereby polluting the air further and contributing to global warming. I do not see these negative externalities of urbanization adequately acknowledged in your ideas. So Eric, where in these increasingly dense urban areas of your utopian future will people, both children and adults, have the opportunity to experience wild, non-domesticated nature and nurture their apparent biophilia? Where will they be able to get muddy, bug-bitten, scratched by thorns, terrified by lightning, temporarily lost in the woods, and have all the other essential human experiences that make us stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the real world? A person needs to know non-human lives and wild places intimately in order to develop true love and respect for nature. Without that, I don't believe conservation can succeed in the long run. So finally, I know I've painted a rather bleak picture of urbanization, and there are exceptions. I acknowledge that there are ways that cities can be made greener, more livable, even wilder, rewilder, as Helen pointed out. But I don't see that happening many places. And so I fear the dystopic trend is the dominant one so far. Thank you.
That was beautifully said, Reed. Thank you. On to you.
Yeah.
Oh,
so,
actually, no, I'm sorry. Helen is
Helen
the
goes
first
first.
respondent after our.
do you care to respond?
Well, first of all, I love Reed's work. So, and also whatever you said, it supports my point of view in a way. But just to be the devil's advocate, we had this conversation at dinner, I think. A while ago, I wrote this article called The Lorax Complex. And yeah, it's about how people come to love nature. And one of the findings was actually that, well, looking at various studies of environmentalists and how they've passaged from, not caring to caring. Part of it is environmental exposure, but part of it seems to be innate as well. For example, very radical example, perhaps, Danny McGowan of the Earth Liberation Front. One of the movies I actually showed to my business students, If a Tree Falls, a story of the Earth Liberation Front. In that documentary, he says he grew up in New York, maybe in Bronx, actually, just like where you are from.
Yeah.
Yep. And until the age of 22, he was never in touch with wild nature. And somehow he watched a documentary himself, documentary within documentary, and he saw deforestation and he started caring. Some people, by this theory, if exposure was everything, you would expect that people who live next to rainforests, for example, or in rainforests, would be much more pro-environmental than people who live in the cities. Well, that's not necessarily empirically so. I come from Moscow myself. I must say, in my case too, my father, who was a physicist, and well, actually that also tells you I'm not necessarily against nuclear energy per se, so forget about the photos I showed. No, don't forget. Well, we went to regions such as Karelia and Siberia and the White Sea region, and my parents were wild about wilderness, and so was I. And I think it helps if you have already something like biophilia or appreciation of nature in you when you're exposed to it. So a lot of kids that grow up in the cities, I think they would very much benefit from more exposure. And also it can initiate others that are not necessarily predisposed to it. But I would say, indeed, I would not necessarily exclude the possibility that you can develop this consciousness while living in urban environments. Nonetheless, once again, I do think the problem is, for me too, the first wild animal I saw was not actually that wild. It was in the zoo, again in Moscow. And I did see that animal, and I thought, wow, what a beauty. I think it was a leopard or maybe a panther. I don't know what it was, but yeah. And I started caring. But then again, if you realize that you saw them there and they're no longer in the wild or they're critically endangered, yeah, that kind of exposure can mean a lot. And I'm not promoting zoos. I think they're horrible for especially large cat predators. But yeah, something, sorry, I didn't mean to actually go against your point in this way, but yeah, that maybe helps you out with the response.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Reed, for your comments. And for those of you who don't know Reed, he's one of the most important American environmental thinkers of the last 40 years, I would say. So it's a great honor to be in the room with him. But I think Reed was arguing about cities of the past generation and not modern cities of today. I don't think there's any urban planner now who's being trained who would imagine the cities that you're describing. And even people in the past. You know, I live in the Bronx. The Bronx is 26% parkland. I live reasonably close to Pelham Bay Park, which is 3 times the size of Central Park. It has a wildlife sanctuary in it. It has these forever wild areas that are managed for nature first, the way we would manage a protected area or a nature reserve. So, you know, I think that idea, that the old idea of cities was that you gave up country, you gave up, you know, an experience of nature when you moved to the city. But the young people, the millennials, don't believe that at all. They think you come to the city, you get a great job, you go to the opera, and you go for a hike or kayaking on the weekends, and you don't have to travel on the other side of the world to do that. There's no reason why you can't kayak in the East River or go hiking in the Bronx. That's part of actually the experience, the wonderful diverse experience of living in cities. So, but you're right in the sense that we have to plan for it. It's not inevitability, right? And you know, the predictions are that the urban area on the planet is going to grow 50%, you know, over the next few decades. So I'm actually working with a professor at NYU now where we're trying to think about, well, what is the area that might be urbanized, and then how do you plan ahead so that you preserve the streams, you preserve the nature, you preserve, you know, the kinds of things you do while you're also planning the infrastructure in a way that makes most sense. Because unfortunately, most urbanization happens in this kind of catch-as-catch-can kind of happening, you know, where people fight against it and they don't want it, and then it's sort of foisted upon them by economic factors. So the idea is that you plan ahead, and if you plan ahead, knowing that these things are, you know, likely to happen, if they don't happen to the full extent, you can always make a new plan. So in my book, Terra Nova: The New World After Oil, Cars, and Suburbs, what I recommend in terms of urbanization is about a density of about 10,000 people per square mile, where half the area is set aside for open space, parks, you know, including natural places, as well as other kinds of, ball fields and so forth. So to contrast that, you know, most people don't think about actually density in a quantitative way. Manhattan is 65,000 people per square mile. So I'm not arguing for Midtown Manhattan. I'm actually arguing for, I don't know, suburbs that are twice as dense as what they are now, which means infilling with a few apartment houses and not making it all single-family houses, and building in, you know, places where you can buy some food and buy the things you need that are within a walking distance of where you live, right? So actually, that's what, you know, smart growth means to me, and it includes, and I actually think it's really important for people like you and me, the conservation biology community, to interact and work with the urban planning community to make those cities happen.
And our next respondent is the Global Land Program's Executive Officer, Ariane de Bermond.
Good morning. Good
Morning.
morning, everyone. Is my mic on? Yeah, good. So I think what might have happened is that we were so inspired by the art of changing your mind. We were all sitting together the first night that we might have actually gotten to some agreements before we. So I'm supposed to maybe throw some grenades. I'm going to try to do that, but because we're all getting along a little bit too well. But so I just to start, I am a pragmatic optimist myself, and so I do want to take this minute to explore a little bit what I believe are the configurations. So I actually also agree. You know, the conditions and configurations that could make intensification, urbanization, and economic growth be the conditions for conservation of nature. You know, because for me, these are all, I think, just as with the rest of this group, these are necessary but not obviously sufficient conditions. And I think the issue that we might want to focus a little bit, I'd like our speakers to focus on a little bit, is that even though we agree on these as being key, neither of you have mentioned the aspects of distribution of the costs and benefits of, you know, development and growth. and also sort of the governance and institutional arrangements that would be required to get to the futures that you both have sort of laid out. And to me, that's really important. So, and I'd also like to say I'm extremely sympathetic to Helen's insistence on a rights and justice-based approach. And, of course, my children play in the stream first and foremost, so I'm all for that. But the issue with intensification is maybe something we haven't brought up, and it's a really key part of the puzzle. And for nature conservation to occur, intensification has to happen in very specific ways. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with the concept of intensification, the premise of intensification for saving nature is that cropland expansion and land clearing is this major driver of biodiversity loss. So what we're trying to do by feeding more people on less land through intensification is closing these yield gaps with existing cropland and at the same time avoiding further habitat conversions. And so it's a part of the triad that you really need for this urbanization and growth picture to actually work, to feed people. But not all types of intensification get to what we need. Intensification driven by markets, which is the kind of intensification that I've been studying in the field, in Myanmar, on the frontiers of production for modern industrialized society, palm oil, soybeans in Argentina. What ends up happening when markets are driving intensification processes is further expansion, based on the rents and profitability of those enterprises. And so unless you have the types of policy and institutional controls in place, that's not going to work. The kind of intensification we talk about a lot in Breakthrough, which I think is proven, is the technological innovation, pulling people away from the agricultural frontier into more intensive types of production, and that actually does work. So we have to really pay attention to what we're talking about. The last thing I want to ask, just close with a few points. I think we need to think, when we're talking about global conservation, we have to be very clear on what the global governance mechanisms are for optimizing this kind of conservation, because we want this biodiversity to be, specific biodiversity all over the world. It's not just in Siberia and Greenland, but it's in places where people actually live and thrive, and we want them to continue to live and thrive in those places. So then again, it's also about not just sparing, but sharing. That we envision these diverse, mosaic, human natural systems, and we figure out what the governance mechanisms are to get to those. And then also just what are the political spaces where decisions over the risks can be negotiated by those who are going to be affected, whose health and well-being is at stake as we make these broad, modernist kind of visions of how we want the future to look. And lastly, just about cities, I'm out of time, in the past few years, I've lived in Baltimore and Bern, Switzerland, a city where I was completely connected to nature, and one where I still we live in the violent constraints of how the city has developed, and we continue to live in that city. And so, yeah, what kind of urbanity we want in the future, obviously. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Ariane. I'm grateful that I feel like you really got at the beginning of the resolution, the most viable path to conserving global biodiversity is through urbanization, economic growth, and agricultural intensification. Of course, you spoke to the viability of that, which is crucial here, because we're not supposed to be debating whether or not, in theory, those three processes would be the best way to conserve global biodiversity, but that they are the most viable path, or not. So in your responses to Ariane, could you speak a bit to that? What is the viability or the lack of viability of these processes? And beginning with Helen.
Well, actually, that's going to be a short response because I've taken way too much time for other responses. Because I very much agree about what you said about the redistribution and governance, and I think these are very big challenges. And remember what I said about the Russian Revolution and taking away from the rich, redistributing, etc. I don't know how to do it. I'm not propagating any of this, but it's very difficult to think of it. What can the governments really do in order to make sure that there are no regions where people are starving, et cetera, because it does have to do very much with distribution. I think agriculture that we have in place now, intensive agriculture, dirty, spread out, but nonetheless, it's already feeding the world, and it could feed probably many more, and if you make it even more intense, even more. But again, there's a question, isn't it better, and in my view it is, to address one of the root causes of it, which is population growth. And funny enough, again, we kind of agree on that. We think population issue is important here. And that's, again, something that, as far as governance is concerned, some things can be helped. So things indeed having to do with women's rights, reproductive rights, human rights, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, if we keep thinking about how to feed the people every time and people are completely self-insufficient anymore because they're dependent on this large agriculture area. Whenever there's war and the supply chain is cut, there are very few people that survive on their own land these days. So that's kind of scary too. And also in terms of social justice, I honestly do think that to live in a world which is utterly denatured, erased. That's what Eileen Christ, my other big hero with Nos, Reed Nos being another one. She says, we're losing our family, referring to non-humans. I mean, what kind of world are our children going to inherit in this way? And I really think it's not just, about being ecocentric in a sense, valuing non-human species. I also very much value humans. That's one of the things that environmentalists sometimes are blamed for. They're misanthropic, they don't like humans. Well, sorry, that's just totally not the case, well, at least in this case, at all. And I do think for us as humans, because I also very much think we deserve to live in a society where we can share things. And if this society is driven by how can we get more food, how can we get even more food, and that goes on in perpetuity, that to me is not a very rosy picture. So that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Ariane, for giving me so many things to respond to, which I'm not going to try and respond to all of them. I think I'm going to just pick up the point about governance structure and how do we get to a world that works for people and for nature, because I think that's what we're all looking for. And for me, it's actually about taxes. So why has the modern economy despoiled so much nature? It wouldn't have if nature was an economic actor. If nature stood up and said, I'm going to provide you clean air at $100 per cubic meter, then we would have an economic relationship with nature. But nature doesn't do that. Nature isn't an economic actor, so we abuse it because it doesn't actually put a monetary cost. So it doesn't enter in our economic calculus. Therefore, the public needs to do it. The public needs to stand up for nature and to put these costs in for the externalities. And for many of you, this is a very familiar argument. If we had a tax that was about natural resource extraction at the point of extraction, and a tax that was about pollution at the point of pollution, and then you relieved other taxes inside the economy, like, sales tax or something that's regressive and not very efficient, then that would actually be a mechanism to lead to the kind of trade-offs that you're talking about intensification, land sparing, what do we protect, where do we develop, et cetera, et cetera. But those costs don't go at all into the land value. When I pay my property bill, it's just about the assessed economic value of my house. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that my house is built on a place that used to have a forest and a little bit of a stream, and that stream is not there because my house is there instead. And again, I write about this in Terra Nova. I call these things gate duties because they're at the gates where the economy meets nature. But I will say, and this is a point I think Helen was trying to make a minute ago for the sort of free marketeers in the room, is the economy is something that's constructed. It's not nature, right? It's something we set the rules around. Tax policy is part of that. Regulation is part of that. Who gets to trade with whom? Our national boundaries are all part of this economic arrangements that we have. And so, whereas I think tax policy is the right way to go, I think you also have to coordinate it with some policy that works in a kind of redistributary kind of way, the way Helen was talking about. Because if some people can buy their way out because they've made choices to earn so much money that they don't, it's like there are wealthy people in New York City, they don't care how many parking tickets they get. Because what's a $500 parking ticket to somebody who's a billionaire? It's nothing. It's no penalty at all. So you have to have some mechanism. And nature, as an example of this, nature doesn't keep all the energy in just certain species, right? Nature is constantly having a way for the wealth, the energy to flow through the ecosystems, right? And diverse ways that allow everything in the system to survive and to thrive to the extent that it can. And in the United States, in particular, we used to have a mechanism like that. It was the U.S. income tax, and we have disabled that system, and we continue to take it down. And the more we do that, the more we threaten ourselves and our society with revolution, which is both terrible for people and terrible for nature. So I really, as in strong in terms as I can say, entreat you to try and share this world with the wildlife and the nature and with the other people in it, and not to be selfish, but actually to be giving, because that is the highest value of human life.
Well, as the adjudicator of this debate, I declare you both right. Thank you.
Thank you,
very much. I should say that I anticipated as we were beginning this that there would be greater disagreement, and then we would converge towards the center, and I would ask you to think about, in your responses to the audience questions, what it is that you agree on. But I think there was a great deal of agreement here. And maybe I can turn that around and ask that, as you take questions from the audience, to think about where you disagree or diverge. We have our microphone runners here, and a question in back. And we can take, let's do 2 questions at a time rather than 3, if that's okay.
So I'm Todd Moss at the Center for Global Development in Washington. I was also the guy that had the gall to run the group that thought that Africans should have the same economic opportunities as other
Sorry
regions
for
of the
mentioning
world.
it.
No, that's fine. So I have a question for each of you. For Eric,
Yeah.
I thought your graphs were very powerful. I think the demographic change is much less uncertain than it was presented in those graphics. The drivers of desired fertility among women are actually pretty well understood. When women live in conditions where there are incentives to have lots of children because of social insurance and the structure of the economy, they have lots of children. When they live in places where it flips, and that's usually when they become wealthier, where they move to urban environments, children become more of a cost rather than a safety net. And then you see desired fertility plummet. And that's why you can get within even a single generation, you can see fertility go from 5 or 6 to 2.
Right.
We've seen that in Iran and Mexico, and we're now seeing that in Africa, especially as you see urbanization pick up.
Yeah.
So I wonder how much of it is really baked in demographically. And then for Helen, I was actually just kind of genuinely confused by your argument around you live a high energy lifestyle, you fly around, you eat meat, you have leather shoes. I'm not sure, what was your argument that people in the Niger Delta or in Nigeria, what's the option there? Are you suggesting that they should remain in poverty? Is that the solution to degrowth? And I think there's a little bit, and I say this with respect, a little bit of a unrealistic amount of social engineering kind of imagined here. We don't decide in forums here or anywhere that people move from rural areas to cities. People individually make that choice. And that's been going on for centuries. People have been moving from rural areas to urban areas. That's going on right now in Africa. Every individual in Nigeria is deciding, do they stay in their rural area or do they move to Lagos or Port Harcourt or one of the other almost 20 cities that are nearly 1 million people in Nigeria. And it may look like those cities are chaotic and ugly or not ideal compared to maybe what we imagine pastoral rural Africa looks like. But those people are making that choice. And governments are also, I think the degrowth debate is a little odd because there's not a government in the world that has degrowth as a goal. So I guess I'm just trying to understand what are the practical implications there. And I think there are some really important issues here around how do you make a city like Lagos, which is already at 10 million, going to 20 million, how do you make that as livable as possible? What kinds of urban planning can they deploy that they can learn from other places? But I just guess I don't know what the alternative to that would be.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really loved about this debate is that it's moved between these very concrete questions and also some of the kind of spiritual questions that Reed has raised and moral questions. And so I will swing it back over to that end of the conversation. And sort of following on what Reed said, I've just read Richard Powers' The Overstory, which is also engaging these issues. And a piece of this new world that our children are growing up in that we haven't talked about yet is that they all live in a digital virtual world and what impact that is having. I mean, my daughter had to be forced to walk across Central Park to high school because she wanted to be inside her headset. And so what impact the virtualization of life is having on all of this future.
All right, so we've got questions for Helen. What is the alternative for going to a megacity if you're somebody living in rural Nigeria? For Eric, how much population change is baked into the demographics? And for both of you, what are the effects of the virtualization of our experience of nature?
Who do you want to go first, Brandon?
Helen.
Okay. Well, 3 questions, right? So contrast in lifestyle. Me with my leather shoes and people in Lagos. Well, that's precisely the point, and I thought I made it pretty clear. I think we need to have a conversation here in the West about our own consumption level, and it's completely and entirely unsustainable. And that's what has to be addressed. Right now, there's this conversation about bringing everybody's living standards up to that unsustainable level. And I don't think it's the way to go. Now, whether social engineering, that sounds, again, like something that the West would do top down, and I don't want to make it sound like it's about your agency or other agencies, although some anthropologists call it a form of neocolonialism as well, in which even, let's say, development agencies that do good, alleviating poverty, etc. It was the economist William Easterly who talked about the white man's burden and the fact that perhaps certain structures that emerged after decolonization actually kept people in developing countries in very much dependent conditions. So I think we need to have that conversation to rethink what are we doing there in the first place? Why are we meddling there in the first place? Haven't we done enough and actually examine our own society and our own consumption levels that are not sustainable? Well, as far as no government that has degrowth as a policy, I know, and that's a problem. And that's something that we have to discuss as well, I think, as a Western society, absolutely. As far as a question about kids growing up in the digital world, it's not really a question, is it? It's a comment, and I appreciate it. Actually, on the airplane here, I watched something that Steven Spielberg made about, it was something like Play One, whatever. What was it?
Ready Player One.
Yeah, Ready Player One. So it's a new blockbuster. It was kind of pathetic, actually. I don't know. You guys, you watch the trailer, you might get an idea. So it's about virtual reality. The kid sits there, and then there's some kind of revolution. I don't even understand what the revolution is about. And he ends up basically owning the same virtual reality company, and that's the great glory. Steven Spielberg has done some great films, but some of them backfired, such as Jaws, how many sharks were killed afterwards. And after watching that film, I think it does more damage, actually, again, like glorifying the whole virtual reality and kids. And in that film, I also noticed there was like one tree, really. The rest of it, people didn't need. It was like ultimate urban thing, and the kicks they got was from these games and racing. And yeah, I found it scary. I found it rather pathetic. And actually, that tree was digitally manufactured anyway, and it served as some kind of background in the park when some romantic scene was taking place. So yeah.
So thank you very much for bringing up Africa. When my conservation colleagues ask me what's the most important thing to do for conservation, I'll tell them that I think it's helping African cities to work better. Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear. And that's true because, you know, exactly what you said. I had to go by a little quickly just because of the time constraints, but I was trying to, that second slide, show different paths of the demographic transition, and it's not baked in. Like I said, we could have 12 billion people by the end of the century, you know, 5 billion more than we have, 4.5 billion more, or we could have 1 billion less by the end of the century, depending on the social policies around the demographic transition. And the most important place, the only region of the world where we're still in stage 2 and not stage 3 of the demographic transition is sub-Saharan Africa. And why is that? If you look at those other graphs I showed very carefully, you can see that Africa is not getting the same benefits of urbanization as other regions of the world. And you know, I'm sure you probably know better than me, but there's a wide variety of reasons for that. You know, and I just speaking from the American context, you know, we couldn't make New York City work until we dealt with the corruption in New York City. You had to get rid of Tammany Hall in order to have public health and a good water system and to have somebody pick up the garbage. I think, you know, corruption and transparency is a huge part of the problem with African cities and African governance. There's also a lack of investment from the outside world. There's also, you know, like you say, it's, you know, people making individual choices, but of course those choices are in the context of the overall conditions that they're making those choices, right? It's not entirely on them as individuals. It's also on the society they're living on. And the sterling example of a different way to go is Rwanda right now with Paul Kagame. And you know, he has pro-urbanization policies, pro-development policies, and actually he's seen tremendous gains in Africa. I wish he was a little bit more democratic, of course, because he's not a very democratic guy and he tends to suppress the opposition. But there's no reason why Africa can't follow every other region of the world in this same transition. And that the sooner that Africa goes through that transition, the better it'll be for African wildlife and the better it'll be for African people. So I'm actually glad for the work you do, which I don't know anything about, but keep doing it. And then the question about virtuality, you know, people fought wars around books when books first came out, right? You know, there were people that said people shouldn't read books because it was a new technology and they didn't know what to do with it. So I kind of feel that's the way we are with digital technologies right now. They are so new, but they are as fundamental as books, right? And we wouldn't say people shouldn't read books now, right? Because we've learned how to acculturate books. And I think that's the same way it's going to be with digital technologies. I would certainly encourage your daughter, as well as my son, to unplug and go for a walk with me in the woods. You know, I think that's a hugely important process, but that's, you know, I don't think it's about the virtualization or the digitization of society per se. I think we're still figuring out how to deal with these technologies. And I expect it'll take hundreds of years for us to figure it out.
And 1, 2, but we'll get to, there's 5 total, so if you could keep your question short and we'll try to get to everybody.
Is it me? Okay. I feel like this is more of a question for the organizers, but I'd love to hear your response to it. We've been talking a lot about the developing world and particularly Africa, and yet nobody from Africa has been on stage offering their perspective. So I'd just like to get your take on that.
Okay. And second question.
I have my best friend and I grew up together, and we have similar values and have made different lifestyle choices. And I just wanted some comment about how it may actually not be so much the decisions we make about how we choose our environments as the choices we make within them. So we live in the outer suburbs, and we back to Parkland, and we have a big backyard. And my friend lives on the Upper West Side of New York in a pretty decent apartment for New York, but not a lot of square feet. And I would say that our children spend similar amounts of times outside. They go to the public park more. We go out, we have sort of the more private space, and they have the more public space. And I think that a lot of it is about choices. And the one other note I would make as an example of that, because in our neighborhood, there are a lot of people who don't spend any time outside, even though we have this great access. And I remember very distinctly chaperoning a school trip one time, and it was very clear to me that this was an environmental education trip, that many of the children had never spent any time outside. You know, it was bizarre to me. They didn't really want to get dirty, and it's very, I think the experiences that we have with nature are to some extent, they make a difference about the plans we've made and how we live, but it's also about the individual choices and how we can encourage choices to have people interact with nature. I just wonder what your comments were on that.
So we're talking a lot about Africa. There's nobody actually here on stage from Africa, and one can still have extinction of experience even if you're surrounded by nature.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I didn't organize the meeting, so I can't really speak to who's on stage, and I was born where I was born.
But you've been talking a lot about Africa. You could speak to that.
Well, yeah, no, I can speak to global conservation issues, which include Africa. So yeah, I think we can all have opinion about other places, but I would welcome African perspectives if that's the way the organizers want to go. I'm not saying my voice is any more important than anybody's in Africa. And you know, I think to this point you make about lifestyle is really important. We tend to think our choices about our environmental choices are all individual choices, but they are completely conditioned by the choices that society makes for us. Like, where does my energy come from? Is that my individual choice? I mean, maybe a little bit when I can choose, you know, to get the wind energy package from Con Edison as opposed to the, you know, fossil fuel energy package. But in fact, Con Edison is laying out the choices, right? This is one of the great insights of behavioral economics, that the choice set is actually laid out for us. And, you know, I think a lot of our fundamental, you know, in America, we're supposed to have a democracy that allows us to actually have some influence on those larger scale choices. And we're seeing less and less of that because of the way our politics have evolved. So that's why in my own work, I'm becoming much more interested in political science and democracy and that sort of thing, because I think that's essential to build the economic model that builds the environmental model that allows people and nature to succeed on this planet.
Well, I'm also not organizing this, so I'm not sure why there aren't so many people from Africa here. There are a few. But I do work with a person from Africa. I actually coordinate sustainable business course with him for many years already. And I have a few more colleagues that are African, and being an anthropologist, I've spent quite a lot of time in Africa. Well, people in Africa have different ideas, just like all of us do. Some love nature, some don't love nature. I mean, it just, I don't know what to say about this. Completely not, you know. It depends whom you invite. I mean, if you invite some person from Africa, it should be a random sample, or what kind of person do you want to see from Africa. I would like to see more people from Africa and actually from all kinds of countries in here. That's why I said I speak with an accent, and I'm one of the 5 of you here like this, or 4. Actually, it was Musa Blipo, I believe, person from Africa, who also spoke with an accent when we've discussed that yesterday. All right, not spending time outside and environmental education. Environmental education is actually one of my specialties, what I publish about. And yeah, this is also a great area of opportunity for developing certain alternative values, I feel.
All right, our time is short, but let's see how much we can do. 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, sorry.
Okay, Eric, I want to go back to your iPad model.
Yeah.
I think that what your slides show is that if we have falling population rates, we could have at least a period of time when affluence could increase on a per capita basis without increasing the overall impact. So I think that that's a very positive opportunity for the next couple hundred years, according to your charts. But then you get to the technology piece, and I find it odd that that's a multiplier, because you couldn't have urbanization without technology. We saw with the Memphis Meats example how technology could relieve huge pressures on land. So technology can go both ways and doesn't seem like a multiplier in that context. And then the last comment, actually for Helen, is that I think that virtual reality would be a great way to introduce kids to nature, because it doesn't really do kids entirely a lot of good to just go walk in nature unless they have a mentor or somebody explaining the story that they're seeing around them. And you could imagine a virtual reality treatment of that would be a wonderful environmental education opportunity.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Nope.
I just wondered, particularly your example of the Bronx, to what extent we're learning a lot of these lessons by looking backward. I mean, we're already a very wealthy country, and that wealth has allowed us to value things like wildlands within our urban environment, and so we're only familiar, I think, with the model of you get very wealthy and then you decide, okay, we really do care about nature in our near-term environment, and so we protect these lands. And
it's not the way. I wouldn't agree with that. But go ahead.
Well, that's what that's actually what I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Is like, are we familiar with a sort of a model where a country grows and becomes more wealthy while already valuing and like wildlands within the urban environment? I just am unfamiliar with it, so I wonder, what does that
talk about that?
Hi, Tisha Schuler. I think this is an important discussion because it represents a lot, I think the majority environmental perspective, where Westerners sit in Western environments and talk about modernization, where 100% of the relevant modernization will be happening in emerging economies. So I'm wondering how your arguments would change if you were sitting in an emerging economy, very self-conscious of your whiteness and Westernness, and what you would be saying in terms of your perspectives in those environments.
Right, so that's why is technology necessarily a multiplier of impacts? Do you have an example of a country that has grown while valuing nature at the outset? And what would you be saying differently with a very different audience?
Yeah, well, I'll go quickly. So to the iPad thing, well, you're exactly right. In the long term, population will go down and hopefully consumption will level off, and that'll be the recipe for decreasing impact. But in the short term, they're both going up, right? So that's why the bottleneck, that's why we have so much environmental damage today. And you're right, totally right. For Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren, technology was a bad thing. I think it can be plus or negative, and we shouldn't underplay the negative, right? And we shouldn't underplay the unanticipated consequences. So to that, and then to the Bronx, right? So, why is the Bronx 20% parkland? It's because when they laid out the place in the 1870s, they put aside the land for it. And why did they do that? Because in the 1840s, they had a huge fight about Central Park. And so they actually anticipated ahead, and they were nowhere near our level of wealth when they did that. And they did it as much for democracy reasons as for sort of green reasons, right? And it would be impossible to live in New York City without these parks. And that idea resonated in all, across all American cities, which have, protected areas from the same thing. And to Tricia, I do give this talk in Africa and Asia, and I say exactly the same thing. Yeah. I showed the data.
Okay. In terms of virtual reality and exposure to nature, I have to think about it. I know that there are programs in virtual reality about nature, and it can be effective. That goes back to what I said, that in some cities, people actually learn to value nature without any exposure. So that's absolutely true. I think it would be a mixed bag, it depends. But I think it's a good point, because if you are in the city and kids watch it anyway, being pragmatic about it, I think it's a good tool to use then, for sure. About wealth, and there are these post-material value theory developed by Ronald Inglehart, and ecological modernization theory developed by Moll and Sonnefeld, for example, that argue that when you're wealthy, then you start caring for the environment, you start doing environmental things, etc. There's also evidence that it's not the case. If you read work of Riley Dunlop, for example, in environmental sociology, it also shows that sometimes wealth is negatively related to environmental care, that actually poor people care a lot more about environment because it's very much immediate in their face. If their river is polluted, they cannot drink the water, they cannot swim, it's in their face. Climate change is very much affecting the poor because it's destroying their harvests. You know, look what's happening in India, for example, with the temperature rises, etc. So I think wealth in itself does not necessarily create that. We do talk about climate change here, and again, we also consume a lot more than poor people. So it's, of course, a very complex relationship there. Now, about the emerging economies, I think it's very similar to the question about Africa and people from Africa. Again, I said it before, I think it depends. I mean, if you take some person from the emerging country, what person will you talk to? They're all diverse. There are so many different opinions. I worked myself as an exchange academic at Jadavpur University in Calcutta in India. I actually spent quite a lot of months there. I also worked in Kenya and Zimbabwe. And I saw a lot of diversity there as far as students are concerned. What I don't like, by the way, about all these questions now about Africa, emerging economies, whatever, I'm trying to make a point here that I hope hasn't escaped the audience, because I do find it crucial here. Right now, I'm talking about non-human species as vulnerable, poor, and with existential threat, and abused, as in those that are being eaten, you know, in intensive agricultural settings, experimented on, etc. It's like if I were talking about gay rights, or let's say women's rights, and somebody kept asking, but what about racial inequality? You know, it's a question of justice, of course. It's a big umbrella of justice, and I do hope that my point is clear. I do think that ecological justice can also serve social justice. But when you keep coming back to this question, but what about this group, and what about this group? And I say, but what about the group of billions of non-humans that we don't talk about enough? Yesterday, too, I loved the presentation by Kate Marvel about climate change. I didn't like the fact that she said climate change is about humans. For me, climate change is also about habitats and non-humans. And that's what I would love you guys, please, to think with me about.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you very much.